Mia lay pressed into the tall, thick grass of the meadow. Her body felt heavy against the cooling earth. Above, the sky was a vast, open canvas of shifting gray and white. She did not move. She did not blink. She watched the clouds drift across the horizon, their edges softening and blurring as the wind pushed them into new, jagged configurations. She reached out one hand, flattening the grass beneath her palm, feeling the dry stalks snap and yield under the pressure. The silence of the field was absolute, save for the rhythmic, low rustle of the stalks swaying in the breeze. She adjusted her position, shifting her weight onto her elbows to gain a better view of the northern arc of the sky. The clouds were gathering, bunching together into dense, towering columns that blocked the sun. She tracked a single, dark formation as it stretched and elongated. Her breathing slowed to match the steady, pulsing movement of the atmosphere. She stayed perfectly still, anchored to the ground, waiting for the sky to commit to a shape. The sky began to churn. High above, the white mass stopped its aimless drifting. It curled inward, pulling thin wisps of vapor into a dense, tightening core. Mia watched the transformation ripple across the blue. The cloud flattened, then extended, growing long, serpentine curves that defied the steady breeze. It was not wind shaping it anymore. The vapor was moving with intent. A long neck arched against the sunlight, casting a sharp, shifting shadow across the meadow. Massive wings unfurled, stretching wide until they seemed to span half the horizon. The texture of the cloud changed, thickening into solid, rounded ridges that mimicked the power of a living creature. It was a slow, majestic evolution. The head took shape, lowering toward the earth, while the tail whipped back in a graceful, sweeping arc. Every edge sharpened. The form became undeniable, a titanic silhouette suspended in the air. Mia pushed herself up, her weight shifting from her elbows to her palms, as the massive, sculpted figure held its position. The sky had ceased to be empty space. It was now occupied by a presence of impossible scale. The formation finished, hovering motionless, a silent, gray sentinel looking down at the field. The massive shape hung in the air, a silent architecture of condensed vapor. Mia remained frozen on the ground, her hands dug deep into the soil. She watched the head of the creature, expecting the wind to dissolve the illusion at any second. It did not. The edges of the cloud remained crisp, held together by an internal tension that felt heavy and real. Then, the center of the creature's head shifted, a circular patch of darker gray deepened, pushing inward against the lighter mist of the surrounding face. Mia stopped breathing. The movement was too precise for air currents. Slowly, the dark patch contracted, then widened again. It was a blink. The creature's eye had opened. A pulse of shadow rippled across the creature's surface, vibrating through the air like a low, resonant hum. Mia felt the vibration in her chest, a rhythmic thrum that matched the beating of a heart. Her fingers tightened around a handful of grass. The creature was not a trick of the light, it was aware. It was watching her back, its gaze heavy and focused, locking onto her position in the meadow with the weight of a physical presence. The sky felt suddenly smaller, the field more exposed, as the realization set in that the entity was waiting for her to respond. The air in the meadow became unnaturally still. The hum that had vibrated in her chest faded, leaving a vacuum of silence so deep that the sound of her own heartbeat became a rhythmic thud against the earth. Mia kept her eyes locked on the creature above, unable to look away. Then, the silence broke. It was not a sound carried by the breeze or a noise from the forest edge. It arrived inside her head, soft and resonant like the friction of silk against stone. "Come, Mia?" The name hung in the air, vibrating. The tone felt ancient and hollow. Her skin prickled. She scanned the horizon, searching for a hidden speaker, but there was nothing but the swaying grass and the vast, overcast sky. The creature shifted its massive head, tilting slightly as if listening for her reaction. "Let us fly." The invitation was clear, stripped of any malice, yet it carried the weight of a command. Fear tightened her throat, a cold, sharp sensation that made her want to press herself deeper into the soil. Yet, beneath the fear, A surge of adrenaline sharpened her senses. She saw the creature's wings dip, a subtle invitation to rise from the grass and bridge the distance between the earth and the sky. The decision sat before her, heavy and absolute. The invitation lingered, pulling at the air around her. Mia remained on her knees, knuckles white. Pulse thrummed wildly. She looked at her own hands, then up at the massive, shifting form waiting in the sky. To stay was to remain within the familiar bounds of the meadow, safe and anchored. To rise was to abandon the ground entirely. She took a breath, drawing the cool evening air deep into her lungs, and felt the sharp sting of oxygen hitting her blood. The fear was still there, a cold weight in her stomach, but it was being eclipsed by a sudden, surging momentum. She shifted her weight, pushing her heels into the soft soil. Her muscles coiled, tight and ready. She pushed upward, legs straightening, spine locking into place. The world tilted for a second as she found her balance. She did not look back at the path she had walked to get here. Her gaze remained fixed on the creature. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by the simple, singular necessity of movement. She took a firm step forward, her intent crystallized, transforming from a passive witness into a participant in the impossible. Mia walked forward until the grass ended, and the shadow of the creature swallowed her whole. She looked up, squinting against the diffused light that seemed to emanate from the shifting vapor. It looked like a cloud, a collection of mist and shifting currents, yet it held a presence that defied the laws of physics. She lifted her hand, her arm trembling slightly as she extended it toward the massive flank. Her fingers moved slowly, hovering inches from the surface. She expected the sensation of damp air, or perhaps nothing at all, a ghost of matter that would vanish at the lightest touch. She braced for the disappointment of reaching into empty space. Her index finger made contact. She flinched, expecting to pass through, but the surface did not yield. It was firm, smooth, and possessed an unnatural, deep-seated cold that radiated against her skin. She pressed harder, testing the resistance. It felt like polished stone or packed ice, solid and unyielding beneath her palm. The reality of the contact sent a jolt through her arm. This was not a trick of the light or a hallucination of the meadow. The creature was here, tangible and anchored in the world, waiting for her next move. Mia curled her fingers, digging into the firm, cool surface to find a secure purchase. The creature was vast, its flank rising like a cliff face against the darkening sky. She reached up with her other hand, pressing her palm flat to test the tension. It held. She stepped onto a slight protrusion in the shifting mass, the surface rippling beneath her boot, like water that had suddenly turned to steel. A low, vibration-heavy hum traveled through her limbs, a rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of her own heart. She hauled her body weight upward, muscles straining as she fought against the sheer scale of the creature. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she pulled herself higher, each movement requiring a delicate balance between force and caution. She gripped the cold, dense edge, swinging her leg over a wide ridge of the creature's back. The surface shifted again, rolling like a slow tide, forcing her to drop low and press her chest against the flank to maintain her stability. She felt the immense density of the mass beneath her, a weight that promised to hold her against the pull of the earth. With one final, lung-burning heave, she cleared the edge and pulled herself fully onto the broad, firm expanse of the creature's spine. Mia lay flat against the spine, arms wrapped tight around a ridge of the creature's form. The silence held for a heartbeat. Then the air around them ignited with sound. It was not a roar, but a deep, rhythmic thrumming that resonated in her very bones. She felt the surface beneath her change. It grew rigid, then surged with sudden, violent power. Her body was pressed downward by the force of the ascent, the sheer speed pinning her against the cold surface. She gasped as the ground beneath them dropped away. The meadow, which had been her entire world only moments ago, blurred into a patch of dull green, then a tiny speck in the darkening landscape. She tried to lift her head, but the wind caught her hair and forced it back, stinging her skin with raw, unbridled velocity. She slid, her fingers slipping on the smooth surface, and she dug her nails into the firm mass to hold on. The horizon expanded, stretching out into a vast, terrifying curve. She was no longer a witness to the earth, she was suspended above it, watching her world shrink into a map of shadows and light. The upward climb did not slow. It accelerated, turning the familiar fields into a distant, insignificant memory. The ascent leveled off into a steady, predatory glide. Mia gripped the ridge of the creature's back, her knuckles white against the cool, firm surface. The air had thinned, turning sharp and biting against her exposed skin. She tilted her head, watching as the horizon climbed to meet them. Jagged peaks, sharp as broken glass, rose from the dark earth to pierce the clouds. The creature banked hard to the left, its massive form leaning into the turn. Mia felt the sudden shift in gravity. She slid toward the edge of the spine, her boots scraping for purchase against the slick surface. She pressed her weight into the turn, gasping as the ground tilted vertically below her. They were higher than the birds, higher than the highest stone spire. The wind roared past her ears, a constant, hollow whistle that drowned out all other sound. She looked down at the mountain faces. They were etched with deep, ancient scars of ice and stone, looking small and insignificant from their current altitude. The temperature dropped further, turning her breath into a thin, white mist that vanished into the slipstream. She was suspended in a void of cold air, with only the creature's rhythmic, powerful strokes keeping them aloft above the jagged, frozen world. The landscape below began to transform as they cleared the final mountain pass. The jagged gray stone gave way to a vast, sprawling basin. Mia shifted her grip, leaning forward to see past the creature's neck. A network of waterways cut through the terrain, catching the sunlight in long, sweeping arcs. They were not just rivers, they were ribbons of polished silver, winding through the valley floor with impossible precision. The creature banked, dropping lower, and the scale of the view sharpened. Each river reflected the sky, creating a mesmerizing tapestry that seemed to pulse as they glided over it. Mia tracked the flow of the water, watching as the silver streams branched out into smaller, shimmering tributaries. The silence of the high peaks was replaced by a rhythmic, distant hum of the wind over the open valley. She reached out, her hand hovering above the passing air, feeling the change in pressure as they swept over the low-lying plains. The sight was hypnotic, a complex pattern of light and motion that drew her eyes away from the horizon. She watched the rivers converge and pull apart, tracing the contours of the earth in a display of liquid geometry. Every bend in the river shone with a metallic brilliance, turning the ground into a mirror for the sun. The silver ribbons narrowed as the terrain rose into a series of tiered cliffs. The creature banked, diving into a hidden gorge where the air grew damp and heavy. Mia braced herself, her fingers digging into the firm, cool hide beneath her. As they rounded a limestone bend, the sound changed. A deep, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the creature's body and into her own. She looked ahead and gasped. Cascading down the cliff faces were waterfalls that defied physics. They did not fall as white spray. They descended as solid, flowing spectrums of light. Ribbons of violet, indigo, and burning crimson spilled over the granite ledges. Each drop refracted the sun, creating a shifting, liquid rainbow that hung suspended in the air. Mia leaned outward, her pulse quickening as she watched the colors swirl and collide in the basin below. The water hit the rocks and shattered into a fine, prismatic mist that coated her face. She reached out, catching a handful of the saturated air, watching as the droplets caught the light on her skin. It was a chaotic, vibrant display of pure energy. She stared, unable to look away, as the creature wove through the columns of falling color. The sheer intensity of the spectrum left her breathless, a sudden surge of lightness filling her chest as she witnessed the impossible geometry of the falls. The prismatic spray of the waterfalls faded behind them as the creature climbed, leveling out into a high-altitude plateau. The air here turned thin, losing the vibrant weight of the gorge. Mia squinted against the sudden brightness. A Ahead, the horizon began to blur, not with distance, but with a strange, pearlescent haze. She leaned forward, sensing a change in the creature's rhythm. It slowed, gliding with deliberate, careful strokes. Then, the haze parted just enough to reveal a jagged outline against the sky. It was a cluster of spires and arches, but they possessed no weight. They appeared to be woven from nothing more than condensed vapor and memory. The structure shimmered with a pale, ghostly light, flickering in and out of focus as the wind caught their edges. Mia felt a sudden chill, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the valley. She reached out, her hand passing through the thin, wispy boundary of an outer tower. It was cool, damp, and utterly formless, yet it held its shape with a quiet, stubborn defiance. The architecture seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the passing breeze. It was a village caught in a state of permanent transition, hovering on the edge of visibility, waiting for them to arrive. The dragon banked sharply, its wings beating in a slow, rhythmic cadence that pushed the heavy vapor aside. Mia gripped the creature's flank, feeling the steady thrum of its muscles as they descended into the heart of the village. The world outside the mist vanished, replaced by a dense, clinging dampness that settled on her skin like fine dew. Silence deepened, swallowing the sound of the wind and the dragon's own breath. They dropped through layers of translucent arches, the structure swirling around them like smoke caught in a current. The dragon leveled out, hovering for a heartbeat above a wide, flat expanse that shimmered with a pale, steady glow. It tested the surface with a single claw, the ground rippling slightly before settling into a firm hold. The creature lowered its neck, bringing its head toward the platform. Mia felt the shift in momentum as the dragon folded its wings. The movement slow and deliberate. She leaned forward, her boots finding purchase on the cool, damp surface as she prepared to slide down. The air felt heavy and charged with a quiet, waiting energy. She stood steady, her hands releasing their grip as the dragon remained motionless, waiting for her first move in this silent, shifting place. Mia slid from the dragon's back, her boots making no sound on the translucent ground. As she straightened, the swirling vapor around the platform began to thin. Figures emerged from the shadows of the vapor arches. They stood in small clusters, their silhouettes tall and wavering. Mia took a step forward, but stopped instantly. The people were not solid. Their outlines pulsed with a faint rhythmic light, shifting from pale blue to a dull, washed-out gray. Every movement they made caused their edges to blur, as if they were made of light struggling to hold a fixed shape. One figure turned toward her, its features dissolving into a flicker of static before reforming. Their eyes were vacant, reflecting the dim glow of the village itself. Mia watched as two of them moved past a central spire. Their legs seemed to trail behind them like smoke caught in a draft. There was no warmth in their presence, only a persistent, rhythmic dimming that mirrored the fading architecture. She reached out a hand, but the air between them felt thin and cold. The villagers drifted rather than walked, their feet rarely making contact with the ground. They were tethered to this place by nothing more than a fragile, flickering pulse of existence, and with every passing second, their forms grew dimmer. The flickering villagers drifted backward, as if pulled by a sudden tide, leaving a clear path through the center of the platform. A figure emerged from the deepest shadow of a nearby spire. It moved with a slow, heavy gait that contrasted sharply with the weightless drifting of the others. Every step the elder took resonated through the ground, a low thud that Mia felt in the soles of her feet. It stopped 10 paces away, then continued with the same measured, grinding pace. Its form was more defined than the others, cast in a deep, earthen tone that held its shape against the swirling mist. The creature stood nearly a head taller than Mia. It did not flicker or blur. It remained anchored, its presence pressing against the surrounding air. It stopped inches from her, the movement of its joints audible, like polished stone rubbing against stone. It stood motionless, head tilted slightly, observing her with eyes that seemed to hold a dull internal luminescence. The air around the elder felt colder, denser, and filled with a sudden, sharp pressure. It lifted a hand, the fingers long and rigid, and held them out toward Mia. The gesture was stiff, deliberate, and entirely devoid of haste. It did not speak, but the intent was clear. It waited for her to acknowledge its position. The elder kept his hand extended, fingers pointing past Mia toward the far edge of the village. He did not look at her, but instead pivoted his entire body with a slow, grinding sound of shifting mass. Mia turned to follow the line of his hand. Beyond the cluster of flickering dwellings, the mist parted to reveal a structure of immense scale. It was a windmill, constructed from dark, weathered beams that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the mist. Its blades were frozen in place, angled sharply against the horizon like jagged teeth. The windmill stood silent, a monolithic presence that anchored the center of the village. Its shadow stretched across the translucent ground, long and dark, cutting through the pale light of the inhabitants. The shadow reached toward their feet, cold and stark. The blades showed no sign of movement, not even a tremble in the thin air. The structure looked heavy, immovable, and entirely out of place among the flickering, insubstantial forms of the village. The elder took a step, his weight pressing deep into the ground, and pointed again. The shadow of the windmill seemed to grow longer, its silhouette looming over the entire expanse. Mia watched the dark, stationary blades, the silence of the machine feeling heavier than the air around it. The elder turned back to Mia, his heavy hand dropping to his side with a dull thud. His mouth did not move in a human way. Rather, a series of ridges along his throat pulsed and vibrated, producing a sound like grinding stones. "The Rainbow Windmill has stopped," the elder said. Each word was a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floor and into Mia's feet. "The mechanism is sealed. Our colors are fading." He tilted his head, and the light within his eyes flickered, dimming momentarily before flaring back to a pale, static glow. Mia felt the vibration of his voice lingering in the air, a physical pressure that made her lungs tighten. The elder pointed again, his finger steady as a stone pillar, toward the massive frozen blades of the windmill. "When the sails cease their rotation, the light ceases to circulate," he added. His voice carried a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that suggested he was repeating a directive long forgotten. Mia looked from the elder to the windmill. The shadow cast by the structure seemed to pulse in time with the creature's slow, measured breathing. The air around them grew thinner, the mist swirling in sluggish, heavy currents that swamped her ankles. She stood grounded, listening to the silence of the machine, understanding the weight of the task ahead. Mia looked down at the ground beneath her boots, where the mist had once glowed with soft, shifting hues of violet and gold. The color was now draining away like ink in a stream. The vibrant patches of light on the village floor turned to dull, flat gray. She watched a nearby cluster of translucent flowers. Their petals, which had been a brilliant pulsating blue, turned brittle and colorless as she stared. The change was not subtle. It was a rapid, visible erosion of the world's substance. Mia reached out to touch a wall of the nearest dwelling. The surface, once warm and glowing, felt cold and unresponsive under her fingers. It turned a chalky, lifeless white. She looked back at the elder, but he was losing his clarity too. The edges of his form blurred, his once steady glow flickering like a dying ember in a draft. The silence of the village was no longer empty. It was heavy with the absence of light. Mia shifted her weight, and her boots crunched on the ground, which was now hardening, losing its soft, cloud-like texture. The gray tide was spreading outward from the windmill, creeping across the village floor toward her. Every second that passed, the world became less defined, less alive, and more like a sketch fading on wet paper. Mia turned her back on the fading elder and began to walk toward the windmill. Every step she took across the village floor produced a sharp, hollow sound that seemed to travel too far in the thin air. The ground beneath her was no longer soft. It had become rigid, like packed clay, and her boots clicked against the surface with each stride. She watched the massive structure loom larger as she approached. It was a monolith of brass and glass, towering over the village, yet it remained completely motionless. She picked up her pace, her breathing ragged, the silence of the machine pressing against her ears like a physical weight. As she neared the base, she passed a set of large, interlocking cogs that had frozen mid-rotation. They were jagged, immense, and completely devoid of the light they were meant to carry. She stopped just a few feet from the central drive shaft. The silence was absolute. No wind whistled through the spokes. No hum of energy radiated from the frame. Mia reached out, hovering her hand near the cold, unyielding metal of the casing. The silence was not just an absence of noise, but a void that threatened to swallow the remaining color from the air around her. She took a final, steadying step and stood directly beneath the massive, silent sails. Mia pressed her palms against the central housing of the windmill. The metal was frigid, leaching the warmth from her fingertips. She leaned forward, squinting into the dense assembly of brass components. The internal architecture was a labyrinth of interlocking teeth, levers, and drive rods, all locked in a rigid, motionless embrace. She shifted her angle, trying to trace the main axle as it disappeared into the dark heart of the machine. The sheer weight of the assembly was daunting. Every joint was fused, coated in a layer of grime that looked like dried ash. She moved her head a few inches to the left, peering through a gap in the outer casing where a ventilation slat had been bent out of place. Inside, the gears were massive, each tooth the size of her forearm, creating a dense wall of cold, unmoving metal. She strained to see deeper, but the interior was swallowed by shadow. The scale of the mechanism was immense, far beyond anything she had imagined. She noticed a faint groove where a drive belt had slipped, suggesting the motion had not simply stopped, but had been violently obstructed. She held her breath, pressing her ear against the casing, hoping to hear even a faint vibration, but there was only the hollow sound of wind whistling through the cracks above. Mia pulled back for a moment, her eyes aching from the strain of the gloom. She needed a clearer line of sight. She reached up and braced her hands against the frame, shifting her weight until her shoulder rested against the freezing brass. The internal shadows were stubborn, but she noticed a thin beam of ambient light filtering through a high, narrow slit in the housing. She moved her head, tracking the path of that light as it cut into the interior. It hit the main drive assembly, reflecting off a dull, oxidized surface. She squinted, adjusting her focus. There, buried deep between the primary gear and the housing wall, something caught the light. It was not the gray of the tarnished metal, nor the black of the accumulated grime. It was a sharp, brilliant point of gold. The glint persisted, cutting through the surrounding darkness like a needle. She leaned in closer, ignoring the bite of the cold metal against her skin. The color was entirely out of place here, a vibrant, metallic shimmer that defied the surrounding decay. Her breath hitched. That single point of light was the only thing in the entire machine that still held any luster. It was wedged tight, anchored against the movement of the gears, and it shone with an intensity that made the rest of the machine look like nothing more than dead, forgotten iron. Mia reached into the narrow gap, her fingers trembling as she navigated the sharp edges of the brass housing. She needed a better view. With her free hand, she cleared away a thick layer of grit that had settled over the internal components. As the dust fell, the golden light intensified, revealing the elegant, tapered shape of a long feather. It was not metal, nor was it a tool. It was a plume, glowing with a soft, persistent warmth that pulsed against the surrounding coldness of the iron. She traced the edge of the quill where it had forced itself deep into the primary gear teeth. The pressure was immense. The quill had been driven into the mesh, acting as a wedge that prevented the massive wheels from turning even a fraction of a millimeter. Every other part of the machine seemed to be straining against this single, delicate object. Mia stared at the point of contact, realizing the scale of the imbalance. The village had been drained of its color, the sky had lost its vibrancy, and the windmill had ground to a silent, lifeless halt. All because this one feather had found its way into the heart of the mechanism. The silence of the village was now tied directly to this small, golden intrusion. She understood then that the ruin of the entire structure rested on this singular, stubborn anchor. Mia pressed her fingertips against the quill, testing its resistance. It did not budge. The feather was jammed into the interlocking teeth with a force that suggested the machine had clamped down on it during its final rotation. She hooked her index finger around the base of the quill, bracing her palm against the gear assembly, and pulled. Her muscles tightened, her pulse thrumming in her fingertips, but the object remained locked. The iron teeth held the feather in a death grip, the pressure so absolute that the quill had begun to fray at the contact point. She tried a different angle, pushing against the side of the gear to create a gap, but the mechanism was rigid, unyielding as stone. Every movement she made sent vibrations through the shaft, but the feather stayed anchored, effectively paralyzing the entire internal structure. She pulled again, harder, until her knuckles turned white, and the sharp edge of the brass housing bit into her wrist. Still, nothing moved. The feather was not merely caught, it was fused into the heart of the drive. She realized then that brute strength alone would not be enough. The casing was too narrow, the pressure too intense, and the risk of snapping the quill inside the gears was too great. She needed to shift the weight of the massive iron plates themselves to even begin the extraction. Mia wiped her damp palms on her sides and stepped back from the grinding block. The iron casing was too heavy to move alone, and the narrow gap kept her fingers from finding proper leverage. She turned, looking for an opening, and found the dragon waiting just behind her shoulder. Its presence dominated the small space, the air shifting with the slow, rhythmic pulse of its breathing. The creature watched the windmill with a focused intensity. Without a sound, it lowered its massive head, the scales grazing the outer frame of the mechanism. Mia watched, breathless, as it pressed its snout against the heavy brass panel. The dragon shifted its weight, a deep, resonant rumble vibrating through the ground beneath Mia's feet. With a slow, deliberate push, the casing groaned. The metal slid an inch, then two, screeching against the rusted bolts. The dragon continued to apply steady, controlled pressure until the entire panel buckled outward, falling away to reveal the inner gears. The massive weight of the housing was gone, leaving the golden feather fully exposed in the open air. The dragon pulled back, its head hovering inches away, providing the space Mia needed. The obstacle was no longer shielded by the iron. It lay waiting, vulnerable to the final pull. Mia stepped into the narrow gap where the brass casing had once been. The air inside the windmill felt cold and static, smelling of ozone and ancient dust. She knelt, her knees pressing into the hard, uneven floor, and leaned forward until her face was inches from the iron teeth. The golden feather sat wedged at an awkward angle, its base buried deep within the dark, jagged gears. She reached out, her breath hitching as her skin brushed against the razor-sharp edge of a rusted cog. She pulled her hand back, steadying her nerves, and exhaled slowly. The space was tight, leaving almost no room to maneuver her hands without risking a deep cut. She tilted her head, searching for a path that would allow her to grip the quill without snapping. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythmic beat that echoed in the stillness of the chamber. She extended her fingers again, moving with agonizing slowness, and slid them into the narrow crevice. Her fingertips grazed the smooth, metallic surface of the inner frame before finally touching the base of the feather. The material was firm and unyielding. She adjusted her grip, pressing her thumb against the hard metal to anchor her hand, and prepared for the final decisive movement to clear the jam. Mia curled her fingers around the base of the golden feather, bracing her palm against the iron gear. The moment her skin made contact, a sharp, searing heat flooded through her nerves. It was not a burning flame, but a concentrated, pulsing warmth that seemed to flow directly from the quill into her hand. She gasped, nearly pulling back, but the feather did not feel like simple metal or organic matter. It vibrated. A low-frequency hum traveled up her arm, rattling her bones and making the air around her fingertips shimmer. The feather was alive with a trapped, frantic energy straining against its confinement. She tightened her hold, trying to stabilize her trembling hand, but the vibration grew more intense, turning into a rhythmic thrumming that mimicked a frantic heartbeat. The air in the chamber grew heavy with the scent of ozone. She felt the feather pulse against her skin, a defiant, surging pressure that pushed back against her touch. It was not just stuck, it was feeding on the friction of the gears. Mia gripped harder, her knuckles whitening, and held her breath as the energy began to ripple outward. turning her fingers numb from the sheer intensity of the trapped force. Mia braced her boots against the floor and pulled. The feather did not move. It felt as though she were trying to drag a mountain by a single strand of hair. The weight of the massive windmill sails above was pressing down, pinning the object into the mechanism with a vice-like force. She gritted her teeth, her muscles straining as she threw her entire body weight backward. The feather remained locked. A sudden, grinding groan echoed through the chamber as the gears shifted, the iron teeth biting deeper into the golden quill. The vibration in her hand turned violent, a sharp, jarring tremor that threatened to shake her grip loose. She let out a sharp cry of effort, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she recalibrated her stance. The windmill seemed to recognize the intrusion. The entire frame groaned, and the gears ground together, pushing the feather further into the narrow gap. She felt the skin on her palms burn from the friction of the iron casing. She adjusted her hold, fingers sliding deep into the grease and grit, and planted her feet again. She needed more leverage. The mechanism was fighting her, the sheer inertia of the sails, turning the simple task into a battle of endurance against the cold, dead weight of the machine. Mia loosened her grip for a split second, her lungs burning, and turned her head toward the village perimeter. The sight stopped her cold. The inhabitants were no longer just flickering. They were thinning. The elder creature stood nearest, its silhouette now so translucent that Mia could see the jagged mountain peaks through its chest. The color in its form was draining away, leaving behind a pale, ghostly gray that blended into the surrounding mist. Where there had been solid, shifting shapes just moments before, there was now only a faint, trembling outline of existence. Mia watched as a childlike figure near the elder reached out a hand, only for the fingers to dissolve into shimmering particles before they could touch anything. The light of the windmill was failing, and the village was unraveling along with it. A profound, hollow silence began to replace the hum of the mechanism. She looked back at the feather, the golden quill now seeming like the only anchor keeping the village from vanishing entirely. The stakes had shifted from a task to a rescue. She planted her feet once more, her jaw set, and ignored the tremors running through her own arms. Failure was no longer an option. The village was literally running out of time. Mia lunged for the feather again, but the iron casing held firm. Her fingers slipped, scraping against the cold metal. Before she could reset, a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Character _2 lowered its massive head until its nostrils were inches from the jammed gears. It drew a long, deep breath, its chest plates expanding with a rhythmic sound like a bellows. Then, it exhaled. A thick, shimmering mist poured from its throat, coating the windmill's inner workings. The vapor was warm, smelling of ozone and sun-drenched earth. As the mist touched the rusted iron, it turned into a slick, golden fluid that seeped into the microscopic crevices of the mechanism. The harsh, grinding tension of the gears began to ease. The metal, previously locked in a death grip, felt slicker beneath Mia's touch. She pressed her palm against the casing and felt a subtle, rhythmic pulse as the machine responded to the warmth. The dragon exhaled once more, a concentrated stream of heat that turned the grit into a smooth, sliding surface. The golden feather shifted slightly, vibrating in its prison. The resistance had not vanished, but the lethal rigidity was gone. Mia saw the opening. The gears were no longer biting. They were holding their breath, waiting for her next move. Mia curled her fingers around the base of the golden feather, feeling the slick residue of the dragon's breath beneath her skin. She took a breath, locked her elbows, and pulled. The feather did not budge at first, but the entire internal housing groaned in response. It was not a mechanical hum, but a deep, resonant shriek of tortured metal. The sound echoed through the windmill chamber, vibrating through the floorboards and up into her teeth. As she increased the pressure, the gears shifted. They were no longer locked, but they were unstable. A massive iron tooth slid downward, missing her index finger by a fraction of an inch. The metal frame shuddered, the weight of the massive sails above pressing down with sudden, gravity-fed force. She felt the gap between the gears narrowing. If she did not pull the feather free now, The shifting mechanism would snap shut, pinning her hand against the central axle. The iron groaned again, a high-pitched, terrifying metallic scream that suggested the entire structure was on the verge of collapse. The cold casing bit into her knuckles, turning her skin white. She had no room to pull back, no room to retreat. She was locked in a physical struggle with the machine, and the gears were hungry for a mistake. The weight of the windmill's internal structure pressed down on Mia's wrist, an immovable force demanding total surrender. Sweat broke out across her forehead, stinging her eyes as she squeezed her eyelids shut. A single droplet traced a path down her temple, but she could not spare a hand to wipe it away. Her shoulder muscles burned, a sharp, white-hot fire radiating down to her fingertips. She could feel the feather vibrating against her palm, a living, pulsing object that seemed to fight her every inch. Her breath came in shallow, jagged rasps that did nothing to settle the pounding in her ears. Her knees shook with the strain of maintaining her stance against the uneven floorboards, every fiber of her being screamed to let go, to pull back and escape the closing jaws of the iron gears. She focused on the sensation of the metal against her skin, ignoring the growing numbness in her arm. Her knuckles were white, locked in a rigid, claw-like grip. The machine groaned again, a deep, grinding sound that vibrated through her marrow. She held firm. Her body was a taut wire, coiled and ready to snap, but she did not break. She forced her lungs to expand, drawing in the heavy, metallic air, and channeled the remaining reserves of her strength into her grip. Mia's boots slipped an inch on the grease-slicked floor, forcing her to reset. She took a ragged breath, the metallic scent of the gears filling her lungs. She shifted her weight, sliding her right heel against the cold iron casing of the central axle. The metal was rigid and unforgiving, offering no purchase, yet she pressed harder. She needed a pivot point. She kicked her left foot outward, bracing it against a structural strut that jutted from the wall. Now she was a bridge of tension, her body forming a direct line of force between her feet and the jammed feather. She angled her torso, turning her shoulder to gain an extra inch of reach. The machine let out a low, ominous rumble, a warning that the internal pressure was reaching a breaking point. Mia ignored the vibration rattling her bones. She focused entirely on the angle of her grip. Her wrists rotated, shifting the feather just enough to dislodge its primary locking bar. She checked her footing one last time, feeling the strut dig into her soul. The gap between the grinding gears narrowed further, hungry and relentless. She was positioned now, every muscle in her legs and back coiled like a spring, waiting for the final surge of effort to tear the obstacle free. The grinding of the gears seemed to drop in pitch, leaving a hollow, echoing silence in the chamber. Mia remained frozen, her body a rigid arc of concentrated force. Outside the windmill, the flickering inhabitants of the village had ceased their movement. They stood like statues, their translucent forms barely visible against the encroaching mist. Not a single voice rose. Not a single shadow shifted. The collective gaze of the village was fixed solely on the mechanism. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the weight of hundreds of silent observers. It was a pressure that had nothing to do with the machine. It was the suffocating expectation of a world waiting for its color to return. Mia could feel the stillness pressing against her skin. She did not dare to blink. The feather remained wedged, a golden splinter in the heart of the iron beast. She felt the vibration of the mechanism against her palms, a low-frequency hum that signaled the machine was holding its breath. The entire village was held in a state of suspended animation. Mia caught a glimpse of the elder creature standing at the threshold, eyes wide and unblinking. The world had narrowed down to this single point of contact. She was the only thing moving in a frozen landscape. Mia let out a raw, guttural scream that tore through the stifling silence of the chamber. She threw her entire body weight backward, her boots grinding against the iron floor as she fought for leverage. Her fingers locked around the base of the golden feather, the metal edges biting into her palms. The mechanism groaned, a high-pitched screech of metal on metal that vibrated through her teeth. She pulled again, her neck veins bulging, every muscle in her arms locked in a desperate, trembling arc of exertion. For a heartbeat, the feather did not budge. It was fused to the gears, a stubborn anchor holding the world in shadow. Mia roared, her heels digging deep into the floor, and leaned back until her balance teetered on the edge of a fall. The resistance was immense, a crushing weight that threatened to pull her into the grinding machinery. Then, a microscopic shift occurred. The feather shuddered. It moved a fraction of an inch against the iron teeth. She felt the sudden give in the gears, a release of tension that sent a shockwave through her shoulders. She grit her teeth, her breath hitching in her chest, and yanked harder. The golden feather slid forward once more, exposing more of its length to the light, dragging the heavy mechanism with it. The final tension reached a breaking point. Mia pulled with everything left in her frame, her knuckles white and fingers locked onto the golden shaft. The iron gears screamed, a piercing sound that filled the entire chamber. Then, with a sudden, violent crack, the feather snapped free from the gears. The resistance vanished instantly. The momentum of her own pull, no longer countered by the stuck metal, sent Mia stumbling backward. She hit the mist-covered floor hard, her arms flailing as she tumbled into the dust. The feather remained clutched in her hand, glowing with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to vibrate against her palm. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, the impact of the fall still ringing in her bones. Silence rushed back into the room to fill the space where the screeching metal had been. Mia sat up, shaking, and looked at the golden object now detached from the heart of the machine. The floor beneath her was cold and damp, vibrating with a new, strange rhythm. She stayed on the ground for a second, catching her breath, while the mechanism above her began to tremble in anticipation of the movement to come. The silence did not last. Deep within the core of the windmill, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed against the stone walls. It started as a low tremor that traveled through the floor, vibrating up Mia's spine. Then the central iron gears groaned. They shifted slowly, teeth catching and sliding with a sound like grinding boulders. A spark erupted where the metal faces met, bright and searing against the dim interior. Mia shielded her eyes as a second, larger spark shower sprayed outward, lighting the dark chamber in jagged flashes. The gears began to gain momentum, moving with an aggressive, unstoppable force. Metal shrieked as decades of rust were shredded away. The entire structure of the windmill shuddered under the strain, the frame groaning as the massive internal components synchronized. Sparks flew in wild, curling arcs, illuminating the mist that clung to the ceiling. The sound rose from a low rumble to a deafening mechanical roar. It was the sound of a heart finding its beat again. Each rotation of the heavy cogs sent a fresh wave of heat and vibration through the room. The mechanism was alive, tearing through its own inertia as the windmill began to wake. Above the internal mechanical roar, a heavy, rhythmic straining sound echoed. The massive sails, stalled for ages, gave a violent, shuddering lurch. They groaned against the sky, fighting the inertia of the frozen frame. Mia stared upward through the open slats as the top sail dipped, then dragged across the heavy air. It moved with the force of a falling mountain. A second lurch followed, louder than the first, as the connection points snapped into place. With a sudden, booming crack, the blades cut through the atmosphere. The first full rotation began, a massive sweep that carved a path through the suffocating gray. A gust of wind, cold and sudden, erupted from the turning blades. It hit the ground with enough force to kick up clouds of debris. The stagnant mist, which had clung to the village like a burial shroud, was caught in the turbulence and shredded into nothing. The air cleared in a heartbeat, revealing the sharp, jagged horizon beyond the village walls. The windmill was turning, and the world was finally breathing again. Mia wiped the grit from her eyes, watching as the sails completed their cycle, their shadow passing over her with the regularity of a ticking clock. The sun dipped toward the jagged peaks, its final rays stretching long and thin across the village. Mia stood at the base of the tower, her eyes fixed on the rotating blades above. Each movement of the sail cut through the fading light, creating a rhythmic flicker that pulsed against the ground. The sun hit the horizon, turning from pale yellow to a deep, molten amber. As the next sail swept upward, it caught the direct beam of the setting sun. The impact was instantaneous. The entire structure flared, the surface of the blades drinking in the light and holding it fast. It did not merely reflect the sun. It amplified the energy, glowing with an intensity that burned white at the edges. Mia shielded her face as the windmill transformed into a beacon, a pillar of pure, radiant force, standing against the encroaching twilight. The metal frame hummed, the vibration so intense it buzzed in her teeth. It was a lighthouse for the sky, the searing point of light that turned the dark village into a silhouette. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with every pass of the blades, the air around the tower ionizing into a shimmering, static haze. The windmill was no longer just a machine, it was a conduit for the dying day, burning with a fierce, singular purpose. The white light held for a heartbeat. Then the structure groaned. The blades shuddered, vibrating with a frequency that shattered the silence of the village. Suddenly, the concentration broke. A violent prism effect tore across the sails, forcing the stored energy outward. Red, blue, and gold light erupted in jagged, brilliant streaks that pierced the twilight. It was not a steady glow anymore, but a chaotic, beautiful surge. The colors tore through the atmosphere, painting the gray sky with broad, sweeping strokes of intensity. Mia fell back, shielding her eyes as the sky above her transformed. The streaks expanded, overlapping and weaving together in a display that turned the horizon into a canvas of pure saturation. Gold shimmered against deep velvet blues, while crimson trails carved paths through the clouds. The air felt heavy, charged with the sudden weight of the returning spectrum. Each rotation of the windmill cast a new pulse of color further out, pushing the boundaries of the light until the entire canopy above was ablaze with movement. The gray world was gone, replaced by a violent, shifting masterpiece of light that defied the fading day. The windmill pulsed, a central heart pumping life back into the sky, and every streak of color left a glowing trail that lingered long after the sails passed. The wave of light rolled off the windmill like a tide hitting a shore. It swept across the village, the vibrant hues of red, blue, and gold drenching the mist-bound architecture. Mia watched as the color washed over the structures, turning translucent gray walls into solid, textured stone. The flickering inhabitants caught the wave full force. They stumbled, their hands flying up to shield their faces as the brilliance crashed into them. For a moment, they blurred into chaotic shapes of static, their edges oscillating violently between ghost and reality. Then, the light took hold. The mist condensed, binding into skin, bone, and substance. The elders, who had been mere whispers of vapor seconds ago, straightened their backs as gravity reclaimed them. Their feet struck the ground with audible thuds, sending up puffs of dust that glowed in the ambient light. They blinked, the color returning to their eyes, their presence anchoring firmly into the once shifting earth. The village stopped vibrating. The air grew dense and still, no longer thin or permeable. Every surface shimmered with renewed depth, the colors settling into place, like paint drying on a canvas. The inhabitants reached out to touch the walls, their fingers finding resistance where there had been only air. Life had returned, and it was heavy, solid, and undeniably present. Above the village, the sky erupted in movement. The cloud creatures, once sluggish and dim, caught the surging light and broke their formation. They dove toward the windmill, twisting in mid-air with sudden, sharp grace. The air whistled as they cut through the clouds, their bodies glowing with the same vibrant hues now saturating the village. They began to circle the windmill in a frantic, beautiful rhythm. One by one, they darted between the spinning sails, their forms stretching and snapping back into shape like ribbons in a gale. The windmill caught the light, casting long, sweeping beams that the creatures chased through the darkening sky. It was a chaotic dance of pure speed. They collided in bursts of sparks, tumbled through the currents, and reformed in tighter, faster spirals. The sound of their movement became a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the chest. They looped around the central spire, leaving trails of luminescence that hung in the air, weaving a web of color that spanned the entire horizon. Each creature pulsed in time with the spinning blades, a synchronized heartbeat of light and energy. The sky was no longer a void, but a living, breathing celebration, alive with the frantic, joyous motion of the cloud creatures, dancing in the wake of the windmill's return. Mia remained in the center of the plaza as the rhythmic pulse of the sky began to mellow. The air, once thin and biting, now held a pleasant, resonant warmth. She looked down at her right hand. The golden feather was still clutched firmly in her grip, its surface pulsing with a faint, residual hum that vibrated against her palm. It was heavier than it had looked when wedged in the gears, a solid piece of evidence that the thread had been dismantled. She curled her fingers tighter around the quill, feeling the sharp, rigid edge press into her skin. Around her, the light from the windmill cast long, steady shadows that no longer flickered or bled into the surrounding mist. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting the air. It was no longer sterile, but rich with the scent of ozone and damp earth. She stood perfectly still, letting the vibrant hues of the restored village wash over her. A sense of finality settled into her limbs, replacing the frantic energy of the mechanical repair. She was no longer just an observer of this strange world. She was the reason it had regained its color. She opened her hand slightly, watching the golden light catch the barbs of the feather, and took a steadying step forward, her boots clicking firmly against the now solid stone of the village square. The elder creature emerged from the gathering crowd, his movements no longer jerky or blurred. As he stepped into the light cast by the windmill, his form underwent a visible shift. The translucent edges of his body thickened, turning from pale gray mist into a solid, warm amber. He stopped a few paces from Mia, his feet pressing firmly onto the stone, no longer passing through the surface. He looked at the golden feather in her hand, then met her eyes. The flickering, unstable glow that had defined his existence for so long now burned with a steady, intense brilliance. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, radiating a gentle, dry heat that felt like sunlight on a winter day. Mia watched as he drew his hand back and lowered his head. He bent his back in a slow, deliberate arc, holding the position until his forehead nearly touched the ground. It was not a gesture of subservience, but of profound recognition. When he straightened, the light around him pulsed in a rhythmic, calm cadence. He remained silent, letting the warmth of his presence convey what words could not. His transformation was complete, a static, glowing testament to the life restored to the village. He stood tall, the amber light spilling over the plaza, and offered a final, steady nod of gratitude. The windmill groaned once, then settled into a rhythmic, harmonic spin. With every revolution, the horizon began to bleed. It started as a faint wash of violet, then deepened into a searing, impossible gold that pushed against the edges of the world. Mia shielded her eyes, but the light was not harsh. It felt like warm water washing over the skin. Above, the clouds caught the rotation, bending and stretching into new, vivid shapes that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the mechanical hum. The sky was no longer a static backdrop. It shifted from deep indigo to burning crimson, then back to a vibrant electric cyan. Each color change sent a ripple through the air that Mia could feel against her cheeks, a soft, pressurized vibration. The ground beneath her boots reflected the spectacle, the stones taking on the shifting hues of the heavens above. She watched as a wave of liquid emerald swept across the distant peaks, turning the jagged rock into glowing glass. The entire horizon had become a living canvas, breathing in rhythm with the windmill's steady, mechanical heartbeat. The villagers stood rooted, their own forms flickering with the reflected radiance of the sky. It was a total saturation of color, a world reborn in light, pulsing with the life Mia had just restored to the mechanism. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, drawing Mia's attention away from the brilliant horizon. The dragon had moved closer, his massive head dipping low until his snout was inches from her shoulder. He exhaled a long, steady breath that smelled of ozone and high-altitude air. He shifted his weight, wings slightly unfurling to catch the swirling currents of light. He did not roar, but his intent was clear. He turned his neck toward the sky, then back to the village, a silent command. Mia turned to the crowd. The villagers, now solid and vibrant, raised their hands in a slow, synchronized motion. Their arms moved like reeds in a gentle river, a collective wave of gratitude that rippled through the plaza. Mia stepped toward the dragon, her boots clicking against the stone floor. She found the familiar ridge between his shoulder blades and gripped the firm texture of his flank. She pulled herself up, feeling the immense heat radiating from his skin. With a powerful shove from his hind legs, the dragon launched himself from the plaza. The wind whipped past them as they ascended, the village shrinking into a small, glowing jewel against the vast, colorful expanse of the sky. They left the mist world behind, rising into the currents of the upper air. The vibrant colors of the mist world faded into the distance, replaced by the deep, deepening blues of approaching twilight. High above the jagged peaks, the air grew thin and crisp. Mia pressed her chest against the dragon's back, feeling the rhythmic, powerful contraction of his muscles as he adjusted his wings. The wind shifted, losing its midday heat and carrying the sharp, clean scent of coming frost. Below them, the rivers no longer shone like silver ribbons. They turned to dark glass, winding through the darkening landscape. The dragon banked hard to the left, his massive form carving a wide arc through the cooling evening air. Every beat of his wings felt measured, a smooth, gliding motion that carried them effortlessly toward the horizon. Mia watched the stars begin to prick through the velvet canopy above. The meadow, their original point of departure, appeared as a faint shadow in the distance. The dragon held his course, his flight path steady as he descended in a long, unbroken line. The rush of wind in Mia's ears softened to a low whistle. They were moving faster now, cutting through the stillness of the dusk. The world below grew larger, the familiar silhouettes of the trees beginning to take shape against the dimming light. The dragon pulled his wings back, increasing the angle of his descent. The low whistle of wind intensified for a heartbeat, then vanished as he flared his wings just above the tall grass. The sudden resistance pushed Mia forward, forcing her to tighten her grip on his flank to maintain her balance. He hovered, his heavy claws hovering inches above the earth, kicking up a light spray of dust and dried blades. Mia felt the shift in his muscles as he steadied his hover. She released her hold, swung one leg over his side, and slid down the curve of his flank. Her boots hit the soil with a solid, jarring thud. She stumbled once, caught her footing, and stood upright. The grass brushed against her knees, cool and damp with the evening dew. The dragon remained motionless, his chest heaving with deep, rhythmic breaths. His massive head turned, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the newly emerged stars. Mia reached out, her palm resting briefly against the rough, cooling scales near his neck. The ground was still beneath her feet, a stark contrast to the fluid motion of the flight. She took a breath, the air here smelling of earth and night-blooming flowers. The flight had ended. Mia remained motionless, her fingers still tingling from the residual warmth of his scales. The dragon did not move, yet the air around him began to shift. It started at the edges of his wings. The firm, leathery texture she had touched seconds ago began to blur, thinning into translucent layers of mist. Mia watched, her breath hitched, as the defined edges of his massive neck softened. The light that had once caught his scales now passed through him, turning his form into a ghost of shifting gray vapor. He pulsed once, a slow, rhythmic expansion of his chest, and then the solidity broke completely. His heavy claws, which had pressed into the soil, lifted and dissolved into wisps of shadow. The wind picked up, swirling around the spot where he stood. Mia reached out, but her hand passed through nothing but cool, evening air. The dragon's shape elongated, caught in the currents of the breeze, flowing upward to rejoin the gathering clouds above. The weight of his presence vanished from the meadow. There was no sound of departure, only the soft rustle of grass as the last traces of his form drifted into the sky. He was no longer a creature, he was simply the evening mist, drifting into the gathering dark. The meadow returned to its original silence. Mia stood perfectly still, her feet rooted in the damp earth. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and motionless. She looked at her hands, still curled as if holding onto the dragon's flank, then slowly straightened her fingers, The grass felt rough against her boots, the soil beneath familiar. Yet the entire landscape felt different than it had hours ago. She turned a slow circle, watching the edges of the horizon blur into the deepening night. The path she had walked to get here seemed miles away now. She pressed her palms against her chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart. It was a solid, physical sensation that anchored her to the ground. She took a deep breath, drawing in the scent of cooling dew and distant stone. The memory of the flight remained sharp, a vivid contrast to the stillness around her. She was alone in the meadow, yet the space no longer felt empty. Something inside her had shifted, a quiet realization that the world held depths beyond the reach of the eye. She stood waiting, watching the darkness deepen, no longer seeking the dragon, but carrying the weight of the sky within her. The first star pricked the velvet curtain of the sky. Then another, then a dozen, scattered like salt across a dark table. Mia tipped her head back, her neck muscles taut, tracking the slow emergence of the constellations as the light intensified. Her mind drifted back to the village of mist. She could almost hear the low, rhythmic grinding of the golden gears. The Rainbow Windmill was turning. She knew it. Somewhere far beyond the reach of the clouds, past the peaks she had crossed. The sails were catching the light, casting vibrant colors into the unseen expanse. She reached out toward the highest point of the arching sky, her fingers tracing the path of a shimmering light. It was not just a star, it was a beacon of the work she had finished. The meadow remained quiet, but the air above her hummed with a hidden, celestial energy. She stood firmly on the grass, no longer looking for a way back, but looking forward with the certainty of the turning gears. The colors were vibrant. The sky was alive. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, seeing the rainbow-hued light dance across the horizon, and smiled into the cooling night. The journey was done, but the motion